Hi everybody. Hello and welcome to Troubleshooting and Debugging the Receiver for iOS and Android. My name is Christian Suarez. I've worked in Citrix technical support for over 12 years. I am currently an escalation engineer specializing in non-Windows and mobile receivers. As an escalation engineer, I work closely with our lifecycle maintenance developers to gather the diagnostic data that they need to fix defects. So today I want to show you the tools and the data that I use to help us resolve issues for the receiver for iOS and Android. So why mobility? It's the new buzzword, right? Well, truth is mobility can make employees more productive and reactive by allowing them to access any resource anywhere with any device. But why now? There's an increasing demand for employees to securely access these resources on the device of their choice, and the pressure is on IT to adapt. Here's a closer look at this fast and rapidly changing mobile market. As we can see from these forecasts from Gartner, you've probably seen these before, we'll see twice as many smartphones and tablets by 2015 as we did in 2012. Now, I'm not going to delve too much more into the research because chances are if you're here today, you're feeling the pressure. Mobility is a top priority for organizations and employees and a big challenge for IT. But how do you know how to find the problem when dealing with the mobile receivers? There's lots of ones and zeros flowing out there. How do we know which ones to look at? Well, there's not been much logging in the Citrix mobile receivers in the past, and what was there was quite difficult to get to. By a show of hands, who's been frustrated with finding logging in the mobile receiver? Yeah, I know I have. Well, I'm here to tell you that we did some great new convenient tracing methods to use for both iOS and Android that I can't wait to show you. So with all the combinations of products and network devices between your mobile receivers and these critical business applications, we need to understand the infrastructure design to help narrow down the problem. These are the major components that we'll be considering in today's presentation. Of course, you have the mobile receivers, iOS and Android, network and web components, NetScaler, storefront, and web interface, and your business resources like XenApp published applications and Zen desktop machines. Now that we see the big picture, we want to isolate the issue by determining which connection scenarios the problem does and does not occur. Perhaps this issue only occurs with iOS devices going through the NetScaler and storefront site to the Zen desktop VDAs. Next, we want to separate the network layers from the application layers by checking out the network traffic. Then we'll gather and investigate key diagnostic data. Now, to accomplish this, I'm going to show you the most useful debug data from Zen desktops, Zen apps, to the mobile receivers. As for an agenda today, I'll start with common network and ICA connection troubleshooting steps. This section can be applied to connections from any Citrix receiver. We'll look at network traces, event logs, and CDF tracing. In the next section, I'll dive right into the all-new advanced logs for the receiver for iOS. I'll show you how to enable, collect, and debug these logs. Then we'll do the same for logcat logging in the receiver for Android. I'll cover some supportability concerns for these receivers, and within each of these three sections, I have a couple case studies to show our steps at work. After that, I'll wrap it up and provide some references, and finally, I'll give you opportunities to ask questions at the end. So let's get started with network and ICA troubleshooting. It is a common practice when identifying an issue to isolate the problem to a specific scenario. Does the issue occur for XenApp or Zen desktop connections? Is there a difference if the user connects from a storefront, web interface, or services site? Is the issue occurring for a specific user base or only certain devices? And how often does the issue occur? Every time, 1 out of 10 times, maybe only the second time? Next, it's important to get clear sequential steps that the user takes to reproduce the problem and include approximate times while collecting the data. For example, here we started to trace about 6:09 on April 2nd. The user logged into web interface from a browser at about 6:10 and launched the desktop at about 611. You'll want to include the expected behavior as well as the unexpected behavior, which is the problem that you're experiencing. If the infrastructure is too complex or requires a proprietary software backend, we must rely on an external repro, and we may ask you for test user access to your environment. This is especially important for iOS, where we don't have the capability to deliver private and debug receivers. This will give our engineers the opportunity to test, create, and recreate private receiver builds on the spot to try to find the solution the fastest. We would ask for a storefront or account configuration, usually a URL, and the test user info. Now, of course, without a security token would be ideal, but if it's required, we'll still find a way to work with you. Now, for client issues, you'll want to compare with other receivers. Did the issue occur with a previous receiver version? This may tell us that it's a possible regression. If available, does the issue occur with the beta of the receiver? Here you can see our beta for Android, and iOS has an early adopter program that you can subscribe to as well. A beta version might tell us that we've already resolved the issue. You'll want to determine if the issue occurs while launching the connection from a device browser or the configured receiver. And also with iOS and Android having a relatively common feature set, it's good to know if it happens with both these platforms. And finally, the real litmus test for receiver issues is, does it occur with the latest receiver for Windows? This could indicate that the problem is actually on the server instead of the client. So next, we want to check out the network connection. We want to know, is there an access gateway in the mix? And is it an ICA proxy mode or full VPN? Or are you using a third-party VPN? Does the issue occur for both internal and external users? For mobile platforms, it's good to know if it happens for both the 4G and Wi-Fi connections. And since authentication is often done on network devices, we'll want to know if it's single or dual authentication. Certificates tend to be a common setback when dealing with the receivers. Do you have public or private certificates? And is the private certificate on the end device? Is the intermediate certificate on the gateway device? And also, you want to make sure you're using a supported certificate and authentication method. So in preparing for network traces, we want to note the IP addresses of all the network devices used for the connection. Look for any unique or custom configurations. And check for logging on the third-party products used for the connection. Try to identify the closest working scenario. Then, if you suspect that there may be a problem at the network level, collect working and non-working network traces. Just a couple of notes specific to the Citrix ICA connection. ICA is Citrix primary TCP protocol, and it uses port 1494. Session reliability uses CGP over 2598, and it's simply a reliability buffer around ICA. It's good to determine if your issue occurs during the enumeration or the connection attempt. Authentication issues typically occur during the enumeration, and connection issues typically occur during the connection launch. With the mobile receivers, enumeration occurs during the initial configuration. And with web interface, of course, enumeration occurs each time. Oh, OK. Do I have to? OK. Now, so what do you do with the network traces? Here are some tips to find the ICA traffic, or the ICA traffic in the network trace. Now, I use Wireshark, but several network tools have the same type of features. First, you want to filter the trace on the most useful data. Identify Citrix connections by filtering on the ports, 1494, 2598. If you have the IP information of the client and the server, you can filter on the IP addresses to view the entire conversation. A nice feature with Wireshark for readability is to add a common name to the IP addresses, or allow automatic name resolution if you're on the internal network. For timing or performance issues, it helps to set a time format to something that's more readable. Once you've formatted and filtered the output, you'll want to find the beginning of the ICA conversation. And this can be done by looking for the TCP handshake, SYN, SYNAC, and ACK. Of course, these three messages start every TCP network connection. And once you've found the ICA connection, you can follow the TCP stream and then identify the ICA sounder, which shows up as 7F in the data. Now that you've found the ICA traffic, we can look for the most common problems. One method of finding the problem is simply use the timing of the behavior. Perhaps it occurred 5 to 10 seconds after the beginning of the connection attempt, so you can focus on that area of the trace. Wireshark has an excellent expert info feature. Located in the Analyze menu, you can get some really useful data out of the Details tab. Here you can identify network saturation. You'll see these TCP dump ACK messages. And you can find transmissions and resets. Here's what a TCP retransmission looks like. If you find one of these issues, look at the traffic and try to determine which side of the conversation initiated the problem. Look at the trace of a working scenario to identify any differences. And use all these clues from the trace analysis to determine if a particular node within the network connection is causing the problem, and then try to confirm by eliminating or avoiding that component. There are many times where you'd like to get a network trace from the NetScaler device, and there are a couple ways to do that. The command line way is with a secure shell tools like PuTTY and secure copy tools utilizing the NS trace command. Or the trace can be gathered from within the NetScaler web console under System Diagnostics. Simply click on Start New Trace. Also, since you'll likely be dealing with secure traffic, to decrypt an SSL trace, you'll want to obtain the private key. There's a knowledge base article with details on steps how to do that. There's some other useful data to collect for ICA connection issues. First, check the system and event logs of the XenApp server or XenDesktop host. You may discover licensing or authentication issues indicated there. Check the event logs of the authenticating server, whether it's a web interface, storefront server, or XML broker. For ticketing issues, there's an STA log that can be enabled. You can enable web interface tracing in the web.conf file. There are several categories that you can enable for web interface issues. And for website issues, you want to take a look at the IIS logs. Now, I've referenced all the Citrix KB articles that you need for the steps in this slide deck here. Now, CDF, or Citrix Diagnostic Facility, is our primary data capturing method. It's the best way to trace most of our server products. Now, it does require parsing with symbols, and we do have a public symbol server, so if you want to get into analyzing yourself, I highly encourage it. It's lots of fun. Nice to do on a Saturday night. CDF is based off event tracing for Windows, which means it has providers, controllers, and consumers. Now, all this means is that you must enable the Citrix modules, the providers, and then collect them with a utility. But first, we must identify where to collect the CDF trace. For session launching issues, we will want to collect the CDF trace on the server hosting the application or the XenDesktop VDA. If you're dealing with application enumeration or load balancing issues, you'll want to trace all IMA XML modules on the zone data collectors and XML brokers. Now, there's a couple utilities that can be used to gather CDF traces while the issue occurs. Today, I'm going to talk about Scout and CDF Control. Both of these utilities will provide a tracing category for Citrix modules to enable specific to the issue. For intermittent issues or hard to reproduce, you want to leave a circular CDF trace running until the issue occurs, and then collect the ETL file. Now, we don't recommend leaving a CDF trace running under normal circumstances, but CDF traces can be taken with a minimal performance impact on the host. And at the end, you'll want to submit the ETL file to Citrix Technical Support for detailed analysis. Now I want to show you a brief demo on the CDF Control utility at work on a Citrix VDA and on a Citrix XenApp server. So to use CDF control for gathering CDF traces, you simply want to download the utility on the VDA from our KB CTX 111961. That's how I knew the answer to Frank's question earlier, if you were here. So this will download a compressed zip file of the executables for 32-bit and 64-bit. Simply unzip and drill down and run the executable. Now, unlike Scout, there's no install process with CDF control, which makes this utility very easy to move around. So once we drill down there and run the executable. So this is the VDA, and here you see in the bottom section, now these are all the Citrix modules that are available to trace. We have the trace categories, which I talked about earlier with a circular log. You can run a couple different ways of doing that log. And then the trace categories, which allows us, again, to only trace the Citrix module specific to a particular issue. Now, if your issue clearly falls into one of these categories, it could save time selecting one of these categories. But if you're ever in doubt, you can simply select all modules just to collect everything. If you selected all modules and you want to clear them, there's an option there at the bottom to clear the selected. And you can select like a couple different categories. I like to do logons and disconnects and reconnects, and it'll select all the modules from both those categories. Now, if you're tracing an event that occurs during a logon of a disconnected session, you can simply leave this trace running, disconnect the session, and then reconnect to the session. The CDF trace will be running while you reconnect. And then once you're done with the entire logon process, you can stop the trace. Now, by default, the ETL file, the trace file, will be located in the same folder that you ran the executable. Now, this is what it looks like on the XenApp server. You'll see there's a lot more CDF modules in there, mainly because the XenApp server has all the server functions. But you see the same trace categories, and you can select these the same way. Now, with XenApp, a lot of times you'll most likely run it from an administrator session, and it will collect all the CDF trace for all the sessions on the box. So that's a little bit different than the VDA, and it will grow very fast. So be aware of that if you select a lot of modules there. So additionally, with the XenApp, you run the trace. You can see the green line along the top there running, and stop the trace when you're done. And again, it'll be located in the location where the executable was. Okay, so to summarize the data collected in this session, for network problems, you want to get the network trace, PCAP or CAP, and you want to get the IP information, the network IP information, especially of the most critical components. The CDF trace comes in the ETL file. Again, you'll want to include repro steps. Here you see nice repro steps with the timing included. And finally, don't forget your other important logs like application and system event logs of the appropriate servers. I like to see those in CSV format, but pretty much any format's fine. So that's a summary of the data collected for this section. So now let's jump right into our first case study. In this case, the long command line parameter, which allows us to send like an argument like a HTTP page or a file to a published application, was failing intermittently with the iOS receiver. So we started troubleshooting by isolating the issue. It turns out that this issue occurred for all the non-Windows receivers that they tested, like Mac and Android as well. We noticed that it worked on the first launch, but didn't work on the next launches, which tells us that it was not working while session sharing. We determined that the issue occurs no matter how we launch the session, internal, external, web interface, storefront. So at this point, it was pretty clear it wasn't a network issue, so we went right to the CDF traces. We did collect client-side logs, which I'll show you in the next session, but they weren't useful in this case. So the CDF traces we gathered were of a successful and a failed launch. Since it happens one after the other, we could get them all in one trace. So we found this host launch request, which indicates the beginning of the session. And then a few messages later in a successful trace, we could see the long command line parameter being sent, which in this case was a URL to Internet Explorer. In the bad launch of a trace, we could also locate the launch host request, and then notice the long command line parameter was null. Therefore, it wasn't getting sent into the session. So with this data, the developer was able to find a defect in the session sharing section of the non-Windows receivers. We fixed the problem for all these platforms, and now the long command line parameter properly gets sent to the session on every launch. Now that we've covered some server-side data, let's get right into the client-side data. First, with advanced logging for the receiver for iOS. So Citrix introduced the advanced logging for the receiver for iOS in version 5.7. Now this is a first edition of this tracing, so there are improvements to come. Advanced logs are based off of AE tracing, or advanced extensible tracing, and it produces an interpreted plain text file that you can look at with any text editor. Each log message includes a time and date stamp, and each message will be of one of the following types: info, warn, verbose, or error. Now, obviously, error messages are something to pay attention to, and you'll see this particular message is significant time change whenever there's new activity in the receiver, so it occurs a lot in the beginning of logging. Really, you can ignore it. Enabling the advanced logs is done from the settings of the receiver. To access the receiver settings, you click on the gear icon in the top right corner, then click on the advanced option, and click on enable, or to enable or disable, you'll toggle the on and off switch. Simple as that. Now, once you've run the failing condition on the receiver for iOS while the log is enabled, you want to collect the logs. Advanced logs are stored in the shared documents section of the Citrix Receiver on the iOS device, and there's two ways to get those logs from the receiver. From the receiver settings, you can use the send feedback feature to send an email that includes the advanced logs on the device. Or you can collect them from a synced iTunes, and I'll show you both methods now. So from the settings, the easiest way to get the advanced logs is, again, with the settings icon, the send feedback at the bottom. This will bring up a pop-up, and you'll hit request help from support. And then you can see the email that pops up has a lot of the information about your device, like the iOS version, the receiver version, as well as the logs attached in a zip file. Or, of course, you can get the advanced logs from the shared documents section of a synced iTunes. Here's a brief video on what that might look like. So once the device is synced with a Mac or once iTunes is synced with a Mac or a PC, you'll see the receiver in the file section sharing of the apps. You want to highlight the receiver, and you'll see the log folder there on the right. Simply highlight that and save as. That easy. You can pull up a Finder or Explorer window, and you'll notice the logs, the zip of the logs. You can unzip them, and you'll see the advanced logs there, and that's what one will look at. So, a couple items to note regarding the advanced logs. First, this one gets me all the time, so take note. The advanced logs will get disabled after you use the send feedback feature, so you must re-enable them to collect more. Also, this feature will send all the logs on the device in a compressed archive, as we saw, so it's important to know the approximate time that the issue occurred to find the right log. Here are a couple keywords that you can look for that tend to be in the problematic errors. Error is a very common one. Not, you'll see a lot in our advanced logs error, and fail will show up occasionally. Now, before we get into the message, I'm going to go through a lot more advanced log messages. I want to make sure that we're not using an unsupported feature. You can always look at the Citrix feature matrix located here. This document gets frequently updated and really is the final word on supportability. So here's what the matrix looks like, and I know it's probably hard to see, but at some points you may notice that a feature appears to work even though it's listed here unsupported. Now, we typically won't mark it as supported unless it's completely supported. So just because it works in some situations, that may mean that you haven't crossed a situation where it will fail. So there are a couple other scenarios that are not supported with the receiver for iOS, and they're listed in the troubleshooting section of the product docs. Workspace control is not fully supported with iOS. It may work sometimes, but there are situations where it will fail. Now, this particular one, we're really trying to overcome this limitation, so that may change very, very soon to try to get workspace control fully supported. So look out for that very soon. Connecting through a proxy is not supported, and there's a limitation with applications may open in a different session. This one is also on the roadmap to be resolved possibly later this year. Now, regarding session reliability support, recently we've added session reliability piece to the receiver for iOS, and I call it limited support. What it will do is it will freeze the session on the client side until you can regain the connection. However, it doesn't buffer the user output, and it doesn't use port 2598. Now we're going to go through a series of scenarios and what the message that you may see in the advanced logs. So in this case, the user discovered the store configuration by entering an email address. This prompted a change store message that indicated the store configuration has been saved on the receiver. Here we have a user enumerating an application from web interface. You'll see this get mobile app enum store messages. It gets duplicated, and that's normal, but here you can see some of the metadata contained in that message. Next, we have a user that has selected a published desktop icon that was already enumerated on a XenApp farm. You'll see the app clicked message. Now, this is how an ICA file appears in the advanced logs. You'll see the ICA message for that, and then there you can see the parameters listed along the. Here's a message that you'll see when the session starts to launch. It's the set session view message, and if it was shown, then that's successful. You can find the session width in the advanced logs if you're dealing with a display issue. Here's a very useful because a lot of times connection issues occur during the notifications that are running by the user, so the user can tell you where it's failed. You'll see these messages, the launch status message, along with the status that it's showing for the user. Here's a message that you hope to see. It's a successful session loading message. And yes, that successful typo is in the message. That may change soon. This is an update video out message. This occurs whenever the user changes away from the view of an ICA session into the receiver main area or some other local application. And finally, this is a session close down message when the user basically disconnects from a session. Another important thing to know about iOS is how to get an application dump if the receiver crashes. iOS uses Crash Reporter to collect crash dumps. And the crash report includes a stack trace. It also includes the crash dump. The crash report is located in the following locations, whether it's a PC or Mac. So now let's, to summarize the data collected for the receiver for iOS, and the advanced logs do come in that zip of text files, and since it is a zip, we want to know some timing of the repro. And there's a good example of the kind of data that we need to go with that log. And if the crash occurs, you want to provide the .crash and .log file. And that's what that may look like there. So here's a summary of all that data for this section. So now let's get into a couple case studies around the receiver for iOS data. First, problems connecting through the Citrix Access Gateway. In this case, the iPad users were able to enumerate their Zen desktops, but unable to connect only through Access Gateway. Users with the receiver for Windows were able to access their desktops through AG, no problem. And the issue only occurs going through the Access Gateway. Internal users, iPad users, were able to connect without an issue. On the NetScaler, they were using FIPS and SHA-2 certificates. So what diagnostic data can we collect in this case? Now, looking at the state of the VDA from the console, there was no indication that a connection temp was being made. So therefore, a CDF from the VDA would not be useful. So we went ahead and gathered the advanced logs on the iPad. In the advanced logs, we could see this host error 183. You have not chosen to trust the certificate authority. So this tells me that it appears that the certificate's not being trusted on the device. Well, we checked the device, and it appeared that the certificate was being trusted. So next, we checked the Citrix client feature matrix. And we noticed that FIPS, SHA-2, is not quite supported for iOS. This support for FIPS and SHA-2 was recently added to the Windows and the Mac receiver, and it is on the roadmap for support on the receiver for iOS later this year, and Android as well. So you can look forward to that. There you can see there's no green dot. Our third case study today is the receiver for iOS disconnect issues. So in this case, what we were noticing is the iOS receiver was causing problems reconnecting to a disconnected session that had timed out. And what we observed is if you let the session time out on the iPad and then attempt to click on the application that appeared successfully enumerated, you would see the following session expired message. Now, the problem only occurred for iOS, and Android was really the only comparable scenario in this case. And it only happened with access gateway connections. So for this case, we obtained an advanced log for the iPad receiver, and it showed the app no longer available message. We discovered a problem in the way that we were caching the user credentials on the receiver. And with this data, we were able to fix this issue in the receiver version 5.7 of the iOS receiver. And now, after the authentication times out, the user returns to the logon screen instead of getting the error. Okay, now that we've covered some server-side tracing and iOS logging, let's get right into Android logging. So Logcat is Android's inherent logging system, and it allows for collecting, viewing the system debug output. Logcat uses the log class, and the receiver for Android always outputs the debug messages to Logcat by default. The output is, again, in a plain text readable file, and it does contain timestamps, although I've seen with some logging utilities you must enable timestamps. And some of the problematic keywords that you may find in a Logcat error, a Logcat log, an error, fail, and fatal exception, which is for crashes, and we'll talk about that in a bit. There are several priority tags that use to indicate the kind of message, and these are those tags in priority order. Now, there's two ways of gathering a Logcat log from the Android device. We've made it very simple to collect and send the Logcat just like the iOS receiver by clicking on the settings dots in this case in the top right corner. Now, the second way is a little bit more cumbersome, and it will include Logcat messages from all the products running on the Android device, and that's with a third-party utility like a Logcat. I'll show you both of those now. So sending Logcat messages from the receiver, again, the settings, you want to click on the Send Feedback, and again, this pops up a Request Help from Support button that you can hit, and it will pop up an email with a single log file attached in this case. And this log file only contains the Citrix messages, which is good. Here's the information that the Send Feedback will collect about the local device. And you can see it includes versioning information, including that of the Citrix receiver there at the bottom. Barely see that. Second way to gather the Logcats is with a third-party utility like a Logcat. So a Logcat is a utility that I like to use. It uses regular expressions for filtering ands and ors. And I filter for Citrix issues simply using com.citrix. And you can also send the logs directly from a logcat via email, ShareFile, or more. So, supportability notes for Android. Again, referring to the client matrix as the final word, these limitations are also noted in the troubleshooting sections of the product docs for Android. And you'll see there are some limitations on the color depths of the session, given that some of these Android devices have extremely high color depths. Now, similarly, workspace control is not officially supported with Android, and similarly, we're trying to get this worked out. Now, I have noticed with Android, it does work more often, I would say, than iOS, but there may be changes again to that very soon, so keep an eye on that out for that. And also, connecting through a proxy is not supported. Now, unlike iOS, we have added full support for session reliability in the receiver for Android as of version 3.1. So it does use 2598 CGP. The session will freeze for the client, and the input will be buffered. So let's jump into some messages that you'll see from the receiver for in a logcat log. Here, a user discovers the storefront configuration by entering an email. So you'll see the discover document URL message. Next, a user successfully logs on through a services site. You'll see authentication successful message there. Next, these are the on-load resource messages that you'll see in a logcat when you're basically going through the web interface site loading on a receiver for Android. And you'll see the URLs scrolling through. Next, you see the download ICA file and launch engine task message. This basically you'll see at the beginning of the ICA launch, in this case from a storefront. And you'll also see it here if you're launching from a services site. You'll see that, again, the download ICA file launch engine, followed by the URL, which in this case you can see is a PN agent or that services URL. This message can be a little misleading. The WF-ICA has died message. This is not a crash, and this is actually a normal message for when the user disconnects, so don't get frightened by that. Finally, unlike iOS, the stack trace is included in a logcat if the receiver does crash. And the stack trace is the most important part of the trace, and we can get a lot of great direction from that. Now, we are working to improve logging messages for both these products, so in the future we hope to see more thorough messages. So data collected for this section, the receiver for for Android. Of course, you have the logcat log, and again, timing steps with the repro steps with the timing is great, and the stack trace is included in that log if there happens to be a crash. All right, so now our last case study. Unknown error connecting from Android through the Access Gateway site. You gotta love an unknown error, right? So the user was able to launch the session successfully the first time, but on the second attempt, it would fail with the following gateway error message. Problem only occurred for the Android receiver and only after a first successful launch. So first we verified the network traffic with a network trace, and nothing out of the ordinary appeared there. Then we gathered the logcat log while the issue occurred. And we noticed this receiver 403 response from the gateway authentication error. With this data as well, we were able to discover a defect in the handling of the authentication in the receiver for Android. Now, this particular issue was fixed in the receiver 3.1.2, and the user no longer experienced the issue. So now let's wrap it up here. For common ICA connection issues, you want to isolate the reproduction, separate the failing components, and gather the appropriate data. Don't forget the important metadata like IP addresses for network traces, and focus on the diagnostic data from working and non-working traces. Great new logging features have been added to the Citrix mobile receivers and made it quick and easy. They're output readable messages. Here are a couple of the base messages you can look for to find the start of an ICA session in those logs. Search for these problematic keywords as well, and then search the same messages perhaps in a successful trace to see if maybe they're normal. Take note of the clear and concise, thorough steps taken to reproduce it with the time markers. And finally, if you need more help, zip up the network traces, CDF traces, receiver logs, repro steps, send it into Citrix Technical Support. With this data at hand, we certainly have a huge head start at getting to the bottom of your issue. So here are a couple of the more popular resources that I referenced, and there's a much bigger list in the speaker notes of this presentation. So now I'd like to take a few minutes. We have a few minutes for a couple questions, and if you do have a question, please step up to the mic and go ahead and ask away. Any questions? Well, I must have done a great job. There's no questions, huh? Anything? With the Surface that uses the WinRT, I've worked a little bit with that. They do have some tracing in that. They use CDF tracing. They also have believe they do AE tracing with that, which you have to enable and then get a. The way we've done advanced logs, we use AE tracing, but we also interpret it. With the RT, as far as I know right now, you still need to enable it, gather that, and then do some interpreting of those messages. But Cloud Gateway requirement for the receiver server. I'm not really sure about that. Again, I mean, kind of my specialty is the non-Windows receiver, and that kind of falls in the Windows receiver. But yeah, I mean, we could take that offline and see and find your answer for you. Question?
Just quickly, so a lot of work done on the mobile receiver to kind of make it easy to grab these logs. How about just receiver for Mac? Classically, when there's been issues, it's been get a private build, uninstall, reinstall, the normal nonsense.
Yeah, you're right. We are adding logging to receiver for Mac. I believe it's on the roadmap for within a year. I want to say the end of this year, but I know we are doing some of that, yes. I don't have a bunch of details, but it is coming. I do work with the Mac, so I understand your frustration there. Question? Chromebook? It does fall into the mobile receivers category, and I believe they have a lot of the same type tracing. I don't know if it's fully ready yet or not, but I know that we are working to getting all this same style of logging into all the receivers, so it is common and an easy way to do it. Storefront always a requirement? I believe so. I'm not certain, again, on that piece. Storefront being a requirement for Chromebook. But any other questions?
Is there a plan to include a lot of these troubleshooting features in the diagnostic toolkit and some of the other products that are out there for sleuthing? Because there's a lot of moving pieces there.
Absolutely. Yeah, again, we just introduced the iOS logging in 5.7, so what I plan on doing is getting some plugins written for TAS so that we can interpret some of these logs automatically. As far as the Citrix Diagnostic Toolkit, has a lot of great stuff. I watched Frank and used it as well. Now, what I showed you was a lot of the old ways we do the CDF tracing. You're welcome to use that as far as CDF and advanced logs and all that on the server side. I just wanted to give you kind of the basics. Yeah. I think we have time for one more question, and if we have more, we can always take it outside. Go ahead. They install separately, independent. So no, there's no conflicts there. As far as the beta versions, having it installed on the same device as the regular version. All right, so before you leave, there's a couple sessions I've recommended here. And of course, you can get the survey starting Friday, the 24th at 9 a.m. And you can download the presentation starting Monday, June 3rd. So I want to thank you for your time. And if you have any other questions, I will be out in the hall. Feel free to come by and and ask me anything you have. Thank you very much.